Welcome to Sideboard MTG. My name's Eric, and today on Standard Meta Coverage, we're going to be talking about the top 8 deck lists from Star City Games Standard Classic. I've also got the PTQ First Place deck and a few choice decks from the Teamconstructed event from Star City Games this weekend. I hope you enjoy. Hit that like button if you do, and if you want to subscribe to the channel, don't forget to hit that notification bell so you know the next time I'm putting out a video. Also, if you want to play any of these decks, don't forget about Mana Traders. They're a great rental service that will allow you to play with any and all of these decks so you can know exactly where you want to spend your money on paper. I think it's a great idea, and I think you will too. Alright guys, I do want to start out here with the PTQ Winter. This deck is pretty straightforward. There's a couple innovations in it that we haven't seen recently. We are seeing some changes in a few of the numbers. And I want to just start out here with Golgari Finebroker. We're going to see this in both copies of the Golgari decks that we're going to be talking about today. One from the Star City Games Top 8 and the PTQ Winter here. Golgari Finebroker seems to be the real deal. It is showing up in these decks. It does give plenty of card advantage, giving you good selection at getting the proper card back from your graveyard. Also, we talked about Assassin's Trophy maybe down ticking to maybe 2 and 3 copies in the main board. That was not the case here, running full 4 copies of Assassin's Trophy in the deck. Another key thing that I do want to point out about this deck is the lack of district guides. Only 1 copy of District Guide in this deck. We will see a few more copies of the deck, of the card, but it looks like most people are deciding to come off of District Guide, and that's probably something we should take consideration of as we move forward in our deck building, that this card just didn't make the cut in the decks that went the distance. So District Guide may be on the out, and that might be something we want to think about. A 3-drop that is taking its place though, and is kind of being hailed as one of the best uncommons in the set, is Plaguecrafter. And if you've played any Magic Online recently, you know that Plaguecrafter is getting a lot of play. People are liking this card. The card is the real deal, and being able to sack either Plaguecrafter or one of your other creatures for some value works really, really well. And there's almost never a downside to it. There is, the what if they have no creatures on board and a Nullhide Ferox in hand. Yes, then it could backfire, but they've got no creatures on the board. Why did you cast your Plaguecrafter in the first place? So I think Plaguecrafter's definitely got a good spot in the meta. This deck overall, it plays a little bit different than some of the Golgari mid-range decks that we have been seeing lately. This one is just straight up Land of War Elves into turn 2 Jade Light Rangers and such, or just hitting your Merfolk Branchwalkers and Jade Light Rangers to make sure that you get enough lands. Now you won't find any ways of just dumping other things in the graveyard other than just explore, and that seems to be enough to give the Finebroker enough targets and stuff to get back. Now we will see copies of Eldest Reborn and Ravenous Chupacabra in the deck list, giving the deck multiple creatures with bodies that actually have really good enter the battlefield effects. Whether they're destroying a creature, making your opponent sacrifice a creature, should be enough to help you keep your opponent with not so many creatures on the battlefield, to help make those Eldest Reborns even more powerful. Now we are seeing some of these decks not run 3 and 4 copies of Eldest Reborn. Just the 2 copies seem to be enough here for our PTQ Winter. But I do want to point out the 3 copies of Vraska Golgari Queen, along with 3 copies of Vraska Relic Seeker. This deck was highly prepared to get around Essence Scatter. Essence Scatter has been one of the big counter spells that seem to be showing up in all the blue decks, and I think that the additional Planeswalkers in this particular deck do help the Game 1 chances of getting around Essence Scatter. If you can get a Vivian Reed down, which Vivian has been performing quite well from what I understand this weekend. A lot of people are really liking Vivian. She's really good at helping you destroy opposing Shalaz and Lyras, things of that nature. Her -3 seems to be absolutely terrific, and then of course, you know, Vraska's -3 is quite good as well. So giving you 4 ways to just destroy enchantments altogether, and then of course if those enchantments are under 3 converted mana cost, then you've got other ways to destroy those with Vraska Golgari Queen. So a lot of destruction here with, you know, leaving some stuff on the battlefield so that you can continue to get value even after you've used your kill spells seems to be the game plan for this Golgari deck. I do like the construction of this deck, and I plan to see more of this in the future. I do not think that this version or versions like this are going to be fading from our meta anytime soon. Now, I do want to point out that there are some dead weights here in the sideboard. And I'm sure against the vast number of mono red decks that we've been seeing this weekend, these dead weights were absolutely crucial to the game plan, along with, you know, cards like Deathgorge Scavenger to eat, you know, risk factors and stuff out of the graveyard, eat additional, you know, spells and stuff out of the graveyard to help maybe even turn off Get to Lava Runners. It's also very good at gaining you some additional life. Incremental, you know, life points seem to be absolutely terrific, along with cards like Wild Growth Walker to just gain a lot of life off of your Merfolk Branch Walkers and your Jadelight Rangers. Now, 4 copies of Duress here should probably not need much of an explanation. Just absolutely great card against those Teferi decks and other control decks. Argyle's Bloodfast against decks that are not going to be pressuring your life total very much, or even against decks that you plan on going into the late game and you plan on being able to stabilize at some point, even at a low life total. Argyle's Bloodfast is a perfect sack outlet to help you get back up on those higher life totals. It is possible to start chaining through Golgari Finebrokers, having Golgari Finebroker get back a Golgari Finebroker, and then every turn you can just get back another Golgari Finebroker, sacking it to your Temple of Acolytes, gaining 4 life each turn, and providing yourself with a blocker is a good way to stabilize until you gain enough card advantage to get past whatever your opponent has going on. Now, there was a lot of Celestia decks in the field, not so many of them actually, you know, topped, but we did see a lot of Celestia decks, and it goes to show here there's multiple answers here for Celestia with cards like Golden Demise and Plague Mare. Now, one card that we did not see a ton of was Vraska's Contempt. Even though the control decks that are Dimir based are playing plenty of Vraska's Contempt, we're not seeing as much of Vraska's Contempt in the mid-range decks, which kind of come at a little bit of a surprise to me, but I do not believe that the exile is as important as it once was, so we may start seeing people come off of Vraska's Contempt. Alright, so before we move on to the SCG Top 8, I want to talk about the standard Team Constructed event. Now, the first place deck, when you go to look at the Team Constructed event, the first place deck and the second place are both going to be Celestia tokens. Now, these were the best 2 showings of Celestia tokens, as there was not a copy in the top 8 of either the PTQ or the top 8 of the Classic. There was a copy in the top 16 of the Standard Classic, but not anything in the top 8. Now, that may show something for the deck, but we did get 2 copies in the top 8 of the Team Constructed. Now, again, that's Team Constructed. The decks may have lost a few of the games and then been carried by their legacy and modern counterparts, but that is just one of the things that I don't like to put a lot of stock in the Team Constructed events, because you don't know the exact performance of these decks. I do know that a lot of people were running the Celestia decks, so it did make sense that we would see some of them. However, they just did not show up in the Standard Classic. So we do need to, you know, just kind of hit off on the first place deck here. 4 copies of Legion Landing, 4 copies of Imara, 4 copies of you know, Saproling Migration, along with History of Benalias to make those early the early tokens. Now, using cards like Conclave Tribunal and Venerated Loxodon to, tap your Amaras to get additional tokens and things like that. Goes with your district guides. Now these are some of the only other copies of district guide. Before, most people were playing 3 and 4 copies of district guide. I think more people are coming off of that, and when we look into Todd Stevens' deck, we'll see the replacement for that. Now, as we move on up the curve here, you'll see 2 copies of Tristani. Out of all of the Celestia decks that I have pulled for you guys today, it seems that 2 copies of Tristani is the route. Doesn't seem like anyone's running more than just the 2 copies of Tristani. We do see a couple copies of Shala, Voice of Plenty here. Just another way to use your mana to anthem your entire board, and that works pretty well with the March of Multitudes that is showing up as a 4 of in these decks. Now, Convoke is an absolute wonder in this particular build. These decks are being able to run 22 and 21 lands because of the flower. Because of using flower, it really just cuts down on the necessary lands needed. Now, we did not see any Conclave Cavaliers, which kind of surprised me a little bit. But all in all, I do like where the Celestia deck is going. But again, I did not see any in the top 8 of the major event. Now, when we do look to the sideboard of this particular Celestia deck that did first place or took the first place seat in the Star City Games Teamconstructed, we're seeing multiple copies of Lyra. We've got Cleansing Nova and Settle the Wreckage to clear the way. So, I mean, Lyra is showing up in spades all across the format. Looks like this card is definitely going to be one of the defining cards in our format. We're also seeing multiple copies of Vivian Reed everywhere, as we did see that in the Golgari deck that I just showed you guys. Tendershoot Dryad showing up here as just, one of those little, boards in a box. It doesn't take very many turns for Tendershoot Dryad to just kind of take off, and once you actually get your City's Blessing and you have ascended, then Tendershoot Dryad is making 3/3s, which is absolutely wonderful. Seal Away and Shieldmare showing up, along with cards like Immortal Sun and Sorcerer's Spyglass to just kind of round out the sideboards. I do want to talk about Todd Stevens' deck. A lot of you guys, if you have been following the Celestia tokens, you'll know that Todd Stevens has been working on the Celestia tokens deck for quite some time. He did come in second place with his version of Celestia tokens, and he did cut some cards. We won't find any district guides here. We're also seeing less copies of Legion's Landing, and that's to make room for some Thorn Lieutenants, and even backing off one copy of Imara. Now, I believe that this is 100% okay, because Amara is a legendary creature, and it is a very cheap creature that you want to play early. And if she does get removed, even if you were able to make 1 token off of it, most of the time you have gotten some value out of it. Thorn Lieutenant, it does just automatically give you that same thing if they go to target it, but late game can get that +4/+4, which really makes it a contender in this spot. Now, as we move on up the curve, we're going to see pretty much the exact same thing that we've seen out of the last Celestia deck. Shala and Lyra, along with Venerated Loxodon. He did decide to run 1 copy of Lyra in the main board. Lyra, again, just being that powerhouse that has to be answered, plus bringing your Shala's power and toughness up by 1, making it much harder for people to kill Shala. Also giving Shala lifelink, which is definitely something that needs to be considered. So I do like these Celestia decks. I just wish we would have gotten a better showing of them in the Standard Classic. Now, we do see the other 2 copies of Lyra, which puts this deck very, very close to the last deck that we've seen. Knight of Autumn showing up in Todd Stevens' build, which it was not in the other build. Now, Vivian Reed showing up as 3 of here. So Todd Stevens definitely leaning on Vivian Reed as his answer to cards like Lyra and Shala. So I do like Vivian Reed, and it shows that a lot of other people like Vivian Reed, and I think that she's in a perfect spot in our meta right now. So If you don't have your copies of Vivian Reed, it might be a good time to go get those before they skyrocket, if it's not already too late. Now, that is one. There is one other deck from the Team Constructed event that I did want to point out, because there were quite a few people playing it in the early rounds of the day, and a lot of people actually, seem to want this deck to work. So I did pick the 10th place deck here. This is a Sultai Control deck. Even though it's kind of like a Sultai mid-range, it's running 4 copies of Thief of Sanity, 2 Ravenous Chupacabras, and 4 copies of Doom Whisperer as the creature base. Everything else is pretty much a Dimir deck, running Karn and then splashing green for Vraska. The deck works off of Thought Erasure and Notion Rain to be able to get some extra Surveil in there. Notion Rain giving you a couple extra cards. Thought Erasure taking away a card from your opponent. A little additional card draw is Treasure Map, which actually works really well with Vraska's Neg 3, which will give you an additional treasure. So as you're having to destroy things with your Vraska, you're actually giving yourself more card advantage with the backside of Treasure Map. So that's actually pretty handy, and it's just those small little things that help make these decks work together and work very powerfully. For removal spells, the early removal, we're seeing Fungal Infection here. I do like Fungal Infection. It does work as a combat trick if you need to get a 2-powered creature. However, I don't necessarily know if it's quite good enough to be able to take down these red decks that have get 2 lava runners and stuff that are 2/2s or 1/2s, depending on the sorceries in the graveyard. Now, Moment of Craving, however, is the exact card needed against those early creature decks, along with Cast Down. Most of those mono red decks are not running legendaries or anything, so Cast Down works just absolutely fine at destroying most of their creatures, and along with Essence Scatter, which I did mention earlier as being one of the most used counter spells currently. Now, if we do look at the sideboard, we'll see some copies of Vona's Hunger. Now, this is not a card that a lot of people have been playing, but it is one that you might want to put on your radar, because there are a lot of hexproof creatures out there that do need to be dealt with, and this deck does very well at dealing with cards one-on-one. So if you have been dealing with the entire board and then they finally hit something like a Carnage Tyrant, then with Vona's Hunger you will have an answer for that. So I like the innovation of Vona's Hunger here. Thank you very much, Samuel. I like the addition of Vona's Hunger in these decks, and then the rest of the deck is pretty much, or the rest of the sideboard here is pretty much just additional answers in a particular range. So depending on what may be bad, against bigger decks and things, the Fungal Infections may not be very good at all. You could just up to either more Ravenous Chupacabras or Cast Down or Moment of Craving, depending on what is or isn't good. Disdainful Stroke and Negate, as always, showing up in the blue side of the sideboard. Now, that is the last deck I want to talk about there that is not part of the Star City Games Standard Open, or the Classic. Now, I do have two quick honorable mentions here from the Classic. This is the 15th place. This was the only showing of Celestia tokens in the Standard Classic. So I do want to point that out. There were not any Celestia decks in the top 8. I know a lot of people have been wanting to play with Celestia. I know a lot of people are playing Celestia. It does seem like it is a great deck, but the deck just did not give the performance this weekend that a lot of us were hoping for. Now, we're not seeing a lot of differences in this deck and the other 2 versions we covered, other than Mainboard Knights of Autumn. So Mainboard Knight of Autumn may be the spot to go, or the route to go. This is the slot that Todd Stevens has the Thorn Lieutenants in. Here, we see Knight of Autumn taking the place instead of Thorn Lieutenant. The rest of the deck is quite similar. However, he is running 1 copy of Ixalan's Binding and 2 Ajani adversary of Tyrants, which are not in the other decks. To make room for that, we're seeing no copies of Flower, and we're seeing 25 lands run. Also, we're only seeing 3 copies of March of Multitudes. So I'll let you guys be the judge on what you think. But this deck did at least top 16 in a standard event. There was definitely nothing else carrying the deck. And I don't want to say that, just because someone was in a team open, they still top 8'd. That means they had to at least win a good chunk of their matches. It's just, it doesn't feel like enough to for me to say that a deck has really stood out on its own, and that's kind of what we're looking for here when we're talking about a standard meta. Now we are seeing multiple copies of Lyra, and here we're also seeing some Knight of Grace, which absolutely hoses most of the black decks, as they just do not have a way to deal with Knight of Grace. Again, Vona's Hunger will help you get around something like a Knight of Grace if they didn't get a History of Benalia off first. I need to mention that this particular version of the deck does run a couple copies of Carnage Tyrant, Vivian Reed, like we are starting to grow used to at this point, and then 1 copy of Watley Radiant Champion. Particularly, I really think that Watley probably belongs in these decks somewhere, even if it is just a one-of in the sideboard. We also see a singleton copy of Divine Visitation, which I think works really, really well when you bring in the Lyras, because Lyra can give all of these angels a little bit of a buff and make them all 5/5s with lifelink, which can really pull you ahead. Okay, so that is your 15th place Celestia deck. Next here, I've got the 13th place Esper Control deck. The main reason I've picked these 2 decks is because they're the only ones without repeat copies in the top 16. So out of the decks from 9th through 16th, these are the only 2 unique decks amongst them. We have multiple copies of all of the others that we're going to be covering in the top 8. So this is just a straightforward Dimir deck. We did cover this last week when we talked about the undefeated decks that were in the most recent list. This exact list was on that breakdown. And it's just a Dimir deck that has splashed white for Teferi and Chromium. For those of you that don't know about Chromium, Chromium is an Esper color and 4, so 7 mana, has flash and flying, so you can sit back and keep your counter spells open for as long as you need to, and then at the end of their turn you can flash in a Chromium, and then you have a flying 7/7, and again, it can't be countered, so this does help you against the counter wars and things of that nature. If they do decide that they want to try to remove it, you simply discard a card and it will turn into a 1/1 human that loses all other abilities, but it gains hexproof and it cannot be blocked, and that only lasts until end of turn. So at the next turn you're back to having your 7/7. So Chromium being an absolute powerhouse and good finisher to help you close the games out. I do like Chromium. But the big winner here is Ritual of Soot, being able to wipe most of the board from most of the decks that we'll be talking about. Venerated Loxodon being one of the cards that actually can come down early enough to put a real threat on Ritual of Soot. If this is their one way to kind of clean the board up, you go ahead and get that Venerated Loxodon down, and you're going to at least be left with a 4/4 that can either do some blocks or some real damage to your opponent. Other than that, it's basically just a Teferi deck with Chromium, and Teferi is the main win con in this deck. Now, looking at the sideboard, there are a couple of Vona's Butcher of Hunger, and then, of course, Eldest Reborn showing up in the sideboard, along with some early removal like Fungal Infection, and then, of course, additional Rituals of Soot, because, I mean, it just really takes care of almost all of the early game, and then if you can follow up with an Eldest Reborn on their follow-up, it should put you well ahead. So I did like this deck, and again, it was one of the few decks that stuck out, and I thought you guys might want to know about it. So, all right, let's take this in from the top 8 deck on into the number 1 deck here. Top 8. So these next 4, they technically come in 5th through 8th, so any real order, the link in the description box is going to give the exact same order that I've got, and that's from Star City Games, so take it how you will. We did get a copy of Mono Blue. Now I've covered the Mono Blue Aggro or Mono Blue Tempo, Mono Blue Tempest Gen deck quite a bit, Mono Blue Wizards, whatever you want to call it. I like to call it Mono Blue Tempo, as that's the way the deck plays out. You typically want to play an early wizard or an early creature like Mistcloak Herald or your Siren Storm Tamer, and see if you can get a Curious Obsession on that, and then continue to push in damage, drawing cards, keeping your opponent from being able to play their cards with your counter spells, protecting your creatures with cards like Spell Pierce and Dive Down, while getting in for incremental damage and drawing additional cards until you can slam a Tempest Gen with 3 to 4 to even 5 or 6 islands on the battlefield, as islands are the only thing in the mana base. So your Tempest Gens are going to be absolutely powerful, definitely large enough to close the games out. However, they do not do very well at fighting with Lyras in the air, so you do need a way to deal with Lyra. You can, however, wait until Lyra has declared blocks, and then use something like a Merfolk Trickster to make her lose flying and first strike and lifelink, so that you can just trade a Tempest Gen out for your Lyras, but that's normally not the tempo play that you're wanting to do. Most of the time you're wanting to just either counter it with an Essence Scatter or a Wizard's Retort, or just put it back in their hand and swing through for the tempo, and making sure that Lyra just never has the option to stop you until you can finish the game out. Again, it is a tempo deck, and maintaining that tempo seems to be quite important. I do want to point out that everything in this deck does die to Ritual of Soot. So against those black decks, do not play too heavily into your board, as one single Ritual of Soot can take out absolutely everything you have, and there will go your Curious Obsession, and it will be a nightmare from there. You do have cards like Syncopate and Negate to be able to stop those. You can even stop them with Disdainful Stroke, so there are a ton of additional counter spells to make sure that you are running the proper counter spell against the proper deck. And that's normally how this deck tends to sideboard. Against the bigger creature decks and things of that nature, you want to put out a lot of tempo very early, be very aggressive, and then as they start to set up a board state that you cannot get through with your flyers and things of that nature, you can just sleep those down here with a couple copies of Sleep, and this tends to be the only answer to cards like Carnage Tyrant, so you do need to be fast against those. Against the mono red decks, you've got the Diamond Mayors, and then, of course, against the Golgari decks and other graveyard mechanics, that you've got a couple Sentinel Totems to be able to deal with those. So the deck is very cheap, very low to the ground. It does play a lot like Modern in Standard. Everything is really, really cheap. You're very mana efficient. I do like this deck, and it is. I was definitely happy to see it top 8 yet again. So our next deck here is going to be the next Guri Midrange, and I guess I'll just start this out with, again, we are seeing Golgari Finebroker. Now this is showing up. Now this particular version of the deck is only running 2 Golgari Finebrokers, but we are seeing 3 copies of Fine, which does kind of do the exact same thing as Golgari Finebroker. I do want to point out that Molder Hulk showed up in this deck. For those of you that do not know what Molder Hulk is, this is a 9 mana 6/6, but it has an Undergrowth ability that this spell costs 1 generic mana less for each creature card in your graveyard. When it enters the battlefield, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you can just instantly dump our ramp when you get it onto the battlefield. It is a giant 6/6, and with cards like Stitcher Supplier and Glowspore Shaman, which both mill up to 3 cards into the graveyard when they enter the battlefield. Stitcher Supplier also doing this on his exit from the battlefield, as long as he's not being exiled, will really help you feed that Undergrowth mechanic for things like Necrotic Wound. And then, of course, you've got your Merfolk Branchwalkers and your Jadelight Rangers, which will additionally help feed the Undergrowth mechanic. And then, of course, to finish everything off, you're going to slam an Izoni, and then you'll have a ton of bug creatures or insects, black and green insect creature tokens that you can start sacking with your Izona to draw some cards, gain a little bit of life, help you get to more control spells like your Ravenous Chupacabras or your Plague Crafters. And then, of course, you do have a copy of Thrashing Brontodon here in the main board, just in case you do need something of that nature. But for the most part, you're going to be just trying to slam that big 6/6 and then make your opponents have to deal with it. So I'm kind of interested in the Molder Hulk version here. Whether or not this sticks around and we see more copies of Molder Hulk show up in the meta, I don't know. This is one of the first decks that I have seen with it, but it did top 8 the Classic this weekend. Now, when we look at the sideboard, we're going to see a lot of things that we're really starting to become familiar with here. We've got Doom Whisperer to help get up in the air. We've got Wild Growth Walker that works great with the main board Explorer mechanics that are in the deck. There are 9 Explorer creatures in the main board, so the 9th one being a singleton copy of Seeker Squire. So just a ton of ways that you can gain additional life with your Wild Growth Walker. More Ravenous Chupacabra, Duress, Eldest Reborn, all things that we're really growing used to in these green-black decks, but just not so many copies here in this particular version. Argyle's Bloodfast just has to be there against those control decks to keep you drawing cards. And then, of course, the 4th copy of Fine Finale. Whether or not that really needs to be there, I'm not 100%. Could that have just been an extra fine broker or something of that nature? Possibly. Do we really need to see 4 copies of Molder Hulk? I guess that we're actually going to have to wait another week to see if these decks continue running this and how everything fares from there. But I was very interested to see, the top 8 Golgari deck, the only Golgari deck in the top 8 of the Standard Classic, was running 4 copies of Molder Hulk. So that was quite interesting. Our next deck here is the closest thing you're going to get to Izzet in the weekend, and that is Jeskai Control. Now, there is a lot of Izzet features. A lot of people are wanting to play, Izzet decks with cards like Ionize, Chemister's Insight, because you have access to Lava Coil and Lightning Strike. And then, of course, everyone wants to cast Niv Mizzet Perun. Ral Izzet Vice Lord is also a terrific card. Pairing that with cards like Crackling Drake and a ton of spells can really give you the edge you need to just crush an opponent very quickly. But this particular deck is splashing white to get a couple extra advantages. I really like the idea of Deafening Clarion here with Crackling Drake, as Crackling Drake will become will have some power left over. He will be able to survive your Deafening Clarion blow, which you can also choose to give it lifelink. And if you do have a lot of instants and sorceries in your graveyard, you're looking at really making a huge turn from being possibly behind to putting your opponent behind and you being way up on life total. So being able to give a Crackling Drake lifelink seems like it would be very, very good. Justice Strike, being able to kill Lyra and other very large creatures like Galta and things like that, could be one of the reasons we're not seeing any of the mono green decks. Justice Strike is very cheaply costed, so even if you need to get around a Nullhide Ferox, it's not that much to actually just pay 4 mana for a Justice Strike, removing the hexproof from the Nullhide Ferox and then just Justice Striking it and being done is probably not the worst thing in the world. Niv Mizzet Perun, absolutely wonderful. And then, of course, if you just need to clear the board, you can always do that with Cleansing Nova. I do have to mention, because you guys would kill me in the comments if we didn't talk about Teferi. This is probably one of the main reasons to be splashing white in the deck, other than Deafening Clarion to pair with your Crackling Drakes. but Teferi giving these decks the edge they need, being able to, you know, do some things on their main turn and untapping enough mana for some control on the opposing turn. So Teferi definitely still a powerhouse in the meta, and is something that we have to deal with. I do want to mention that there's no explosions in this deck. A lot of people are playing expansion explosion in their Izzet decks and stuff of that nature. We're not going to find any copies of that here. Now, if we do look at the sideboard, however, we are going to find Lyra Dawnbringer. She is showing up in pretty much every deck that can cast double white. Negate, just an absolute, you know, must-have if you're in blue. Legion Warboss, I guess against the control decks, this is the card to bring in, as they're not going to leave in a lot of removal spells for a deck like this. So Legion Warboss could absolutely be, you know, that game changer that they no longer have an answer for in games 2 and 3. The rest of the deck is made up of, you know, just good removal spells like Invoke the Divine, Ixalan's Binding to answer any and all things. If there's too much for your Deafening Clarions, you can bring in some Settle the Wreckage and go from there. And then, of course, you know, Justice Strike is just so good that you have to have another copy. So that is your Jeskai control deck from this weekend. Came in you know, 5th through 8th place. Pretty cool deck. There was a second copy of Jeskai Control in the top 16. So you know, I thought that the deck performed pretty well, putting multiple copies in the top 16. So next comes our Boros Aggro deck. Now, this could also be called Boros Angels, but we are going to clarify the difference here. The Boros Aggro is more of your Boros Mentor. In game 1, you've got a lot of low-to-the-ground creatures. You've got some mentor effects here with you know, Swiftblade Vindicator and Boros Challenger, which are both really, really good cards. They work really well on curve with Tajik, Legion's Edge, and then of course Aurelia, the beginning of your Angels, along with Lyra. Lyra Dawnbringer with Aurelia is absolutely wonderful. Aurelia can even give Lyra an additional +2, and then of course, because she's white, she's also going to have Vigilance, so she can swing for 7, have Vigilance to be able to set back and block on the opposing turn. Could absolutely just be everything you need to put yourself way ahead on curve. Now, the deck is not just, you know, soldiers and mentor. It has a very good curve of going Knight of Grace into History of Benalia. Knight of Grace, again, just being the excellent card it is against the black decks. A lot of these black decks, the Dimir decks and such, are having a hard time dealing with Knight of Grace, so landing an early Knight of Grace could be everything you need to punch in enough damage so that every threat that you have after that is absolutely, you know, more devastating and must be answered. So Knight of Grace, 4 of. I don't think that should change. We will see some different variations on the Angels deck as we move a little bit further up, but this particular version is you know, your 5th place winner, and it's more of the mentor strategy. Now, that the mentor strategy does benefit a lot from Ajani, and that's why we do see that here in the sideboard. There are some life gain aspects to the deck, which is why Dawn of Hope is very good. Ixalan's Binding showing up in the sideboard. We had been seeing some Conclave Tribunals in the decks. This particular version of the deck is not running Conclave Tribunal, and it's also running multiple copies of Fight with Fire because of the amount of Lyras that is getting Lyras that are being played. Lyra is getting a ton of play right now, and then of course Integrity in Intervention to be able to pump up certain of your mentor creatures, just to be able to give them that additional ability to put a +1/1 counter on a different targeting, on a different attacking creature, is absolutely wonderful. Plus, you know, combat tricks sometimes work, and then again, if you don't need to do a combat trick, you can always just burn your opponent either to the face or to any target and gain 3 life. So the Lightning Helix on the back side of this is pretty handy, but for the most part, I believe that it's the integrity side of it, being able to pump up particular mentors at the right moment to kind of, you know, spread that love out with the mentor triggers. So do remember that you do need to do that at sorcery speed. So do that in your main phase before you actually move into combat, or do it at the beginning of combat before you actually declare attackers. If you do declare attackers before you pump, you will have missed your option for your mentor triggers. So that is your Boros Aggro or Boros Mentor deck. I do think that the deck is pretty straightforward. I also think that it is probably one of the better decks that you can be playing, and we will talk about more of the Angels decks as we move on up the list, but this is still, or a version of this is still, my pick for where I would like to be in a competitive standard. I do not, however, think this is a great Game 1 deck, and you probably, if you're looking for a good deck for Arena, I do not necessarily think that this is a great Game 1 deck for those people trying to build Arena decks. You may or may not want to go this route. Experimental Frenzy did show up in the sideboard. I think that the converted mana cost for this particular deck might be a little much for Experimental Frenzy, and you might not get the effect that you're really wanting out of Experimental Frenzy in this deck unless you are staying low to the ground. Now next is going to be our 4th place deck. Our 3rd and 4th place decks are both have some red in them here. Now, this one is Goblins and Angels, I would say. We've got Goblin Instigator here, being able to bring in an extra body. We are still seeing, 4 copies of Knight of Grace. We just do not have any copies of Legion's Landing in the deck here. Now, the rest of the deck is pretty straightforward. We've got Resplendent Angel, and then you go on your curve with Aurelia, Shala, Voice of Plenty, and Lyra to round out your Angels. And then of course, we do have some fodder to just throw at the opponents here with Siege Gang Commander. I thought this was quite an interesting addition. Siege Gang Commander paired with Goblin Instigator to give some additional goblins. Haven't seen this tech in a lot of the Angels decks, but I do think that there might warrant some need for it, being able to just kind of chain through getting rid of these goblins to just destroy your opponent. Could be exactly what you want to do if you're dealing with the tokens decks and things of that nature. Being able to deal 2 damage for one of your tokens, just making your 1/1 trade for up to a 2/2 seems to be absolutely terrific. There are a lot of History of Benalia decks, and I am assuming that Siege Gang Commander, in the late game, can beat a top decked History of Benalia if you do have a couple goblins left over. Now, in the main board here, it's still pretty straightforward, like the other decks we have seen. This one is running Benalish Marshal though, which if you look at the mana base, there are very few lands that do not produce white mana to cast Benalish Marshal. There's 1 Field of Ruin and 1 mountain. The rest of the deck is completely white, so Benalish Marshal will come down without much of a problem. My rule of thumb is don't have more than 3 cards that are 3 lands in your mana base that cannot cast your petals, which is the 3 pip cycle that came out in Dominaria. So if we look at the sideboard of this deck, we will see more Experimental Frenzies. 3 copies, in fact, of Experimental Frenzy. So this card may just be everything that you do need. I still think that you're not getting a ton of value from Experimental Frenzy, because I don't think you're going to be casting multiple spells per turn unless you're late into the you're well into the late game. However, if you get something like a turn 6 Resplendent Angel and a History of Benalia off of your Experimental Frenzy, you've actually come ahead. You've gotten a lot of value out of it. So until you've actually seen this thing in play, it's hard to understand just how powerful this effect is. But the later the game goes, the more powerful it is, and having multiple copies of it means that you can freely just go ahead and destroy it, knowing that you're going to get into another copy in in the adjacent turns. So I do like Experimental Frenzy. I do also like it in the lower to the ground decks than I do. I like it more in the lower to the ground decks, like the mono red decks, than I do in the Boros decks. But All in all, Experimental Frenzy, absolutely wonderful card at getting you some additional card advantage. There are 3 copies of Banefire, because who doesn't want to Banefire someone? And Banefire is absolutely wonderful against the control decks, being able to bring in an uncounterable spell that can be big enough to destroy opposing Lyras and things of that nature. We also see, Deafening Clarion, which is probably very incremental in destroying the Celestia decks and keeping those out of the top 8. All in all, I like the Angels decks, and the event was taken down by an Angel deck, so we will be talking about more of these Angels decks here in just a moment. For now, though, let's jump over to the Mono Red Wizards list, and I do call it a Wizards list, even though there is a few non-Wizards in the deck. There's as many non-Wizards in the deck as there are Wizards. In fact, the only Wizards are Gitu Lava Runner and Virashino Pyromancer. The rest of the deck is made up of Goblins such as Frantic Fanatical Firebrand, and Goblin Chain Whirler, along with Runaway Steamkin. Now, Runaway Steamkin actually is phenomenal with Experimental Frenzy. I got a chance to see this a few times during live coverage as I was watching the event this weekend. Having a couple Runaway Steamkins on the battlefield and then hitting an Experimental Frenzy seemed to work absolutely wonderful, because whenever you cast a red spell, doesn't matter if that's an instant, sorcery, or a creature, as long as it's a red spell, you're going to be putting those +1/+1 counters. And then having multiple Runaway Steamkins at different increments mean that you can go ahead and sack the 3 counters on one Runaway Steamkin to gain 3 more mana to continue casting things off your Experimental Frenzy, which will buff up the other Steamkins, and including the one that you remove the counters from, so that you can continue ticking up, burning through mana, burning through cards, building a bigger board presence, getting to more cards. The main idea with Experimental Frenzy, once you get it down, is you want to be able to play down to a land, play that land, play on past that land until you get down to another land, so that your next turn you will just simply draw that land and then play down to the next land, play that land, and then continue playing on down until you're getting to another land to draw. And when you're keeping your converted mana cost as low to the ground as this deck does, that is a very feasible interaction, and sometimes you're getting 3, 4, 5 spells in between lands, or in between periods where you've hit 2 lands. Remember, you can play a land from the top of your deck. With this card, you cannot play lands from your hand. This is not cast, it is play. So you can't play or use anything from your hand. You do everything from the top of your deck. So learning how to maneuver your Experimental Frenzies is probably going to be the new tech for most of these mono red players. I know there are a lot of you guys that are playing mono red. A lot of people were interested in seeing risk factor and how good the deck or good the card was. It did show up in a 3rd or 4th place deck here with the mono red, and there were multiple copies of mono red in the top 16 this weekend, so it is 100% a deck that is going to be around. We thought that mono red might be leaving us, but it looks like the deck has all the tools needed to stick around in our meta. I doubt it's going to be going anywhere anytime soon. In the sideboard for this deck, we've got more Banefires. We've got Legion Warboss, because Legion Warboss is absolutely a boss against control decks. If they can't answer it, you'll get a couple extra creatures out of it. And if they do not have something such as a Ritual of Soot or Deafening Clarion, it's going to be really hard for them to clean up after a Legion Warboss. Also, if you are running into a clear board and you can actually swing with your Legion Warboss, you're looking at doing a little bit of additional damage, making those goblins slightly larger. 2/2 goblins work really well in the mirror against Goblin Chain Whirlers and things of that nature. So if you can keep the board clear and keep your Legion Warboss in swinging, then you're going to be doing some real work there. Fight with Fire, 3 copies, because there are a lot of Shalaz and Lyras running around. This is 5 damage. It will help you deal with cards like Aurelia, which is another hard to burn creature. She does get around lava coils and things of that nature. Even kicked Sheevan Fires cannot deal with something like an Aurelia, so that is something to think about. In the mirror, like the mono blue deck, they're running Diamond Mare here. Just call your color and just start casting spells, and you're going to gain enough incremental life points to kind of set yourself ahead in a mirror burn battle. So I am kind of enjoying the mono red burn deck, as it's kind of refreshing because it is quite a burn deck. Next here we've got Grixis Control. This was actually played by Andrew Jessup, a member of the SCG tour that has been touring for quite some time. I think Andrew Jessup's quite a good player, him and his brother. So I was happy to see Andrew Jessup do well with a Grixis deck. Now, as most of you guys know, that I am very partial to Grixis decks. I personally think that there probably should be some red removal in the deck, but apparently Andrew did not need red removal in the deck. We do see him leaning very heavily on Moment of Craving to help deal with the early creature decks, and cards like Legion Warboss and things of that nature all die to the Moment of Craving. So I do like this this particular version of the control. Now, over the weekend, we seen some decks by Lagzilla, and he was running the Thought Erasure along with cards like Disinformation Campaign. I think with the a rise of Nullhide Ferox, that Disinformation Campaign is probably in a worse spot than it had been in the past week, and I'm not for sure if Disinformation Campaign will continue to see a lot of play as long as Nullhide Ferox is around to cheat its way into the battlefield when someone tries to go for some advantage. So I'm not 100% sure if we will continue to see Nullhide Ferox, as there's nothing you can do about the card. You can't even take it out of their hand with a Thought Erasure the turn before. Otherwise, they just get the Nullhide Ferox. So you can stop things with Essence Scatter and things of that nature. Ritual of Soot does well, but again, Nullhide Ferox does get around that. So if you are playing green and you're trying to get around these Dimir decks, Nullhide Ferox does really, really well. And then, of course, cards like Vine Mare can swing through almost everything that this deck has to offer except for the Dream Eaters. And that could be one of the good major reasons for Dream Eater. We do see 3 copies here. I know a lot of people were on the fence about Dream Eater, whether or not the card should show up in the meta or not. During spoilers and things of that nature, we had a lot of mixed decisions on Dream Eater. But again, like last week, we are seeing Dream Eater show up in some of these mid-rangey control decks, these creature-heavy control decks. Nicol Bolas, I guess we really don't have to talk about how good Nicol Bolas is. Running 4 copies of Nicol Bolas does put your opponent at a disadvantage. They are losing cards when your Nicol Bolas enters the battlefield. But again, we did talk about the Nullhide Ferox, and this is something that you might have to worry about. You can get around that with just having your opponent sacrifice it with something like an Eldest Reborn or a Vraska's Contempt, but a Vraska's Contempt would cost you 6 mana to be able to get that Nullhide Ferox. So that is something to think about. Dream Eater is a card that can block Vine Mare, so that alone may be the biggest reason to have a card like Dream Eater. So another card that I want to point out in this deck is the singleton copy of Fungal Infection. It is an instant speed, and it does technically make you a blocker that you can put in front of something and make something else smaller. So it does kind of work like a combat trick, and you can get cards like Legion Warboss and things like that with it. However, again, I'm just not a big fan of Fungal Infection, but it could be the card that we have to use for the slot. If you're like me, you've been playing with Fatal Push for a long time, and this just does not feel as good, but it may be the tool that we have to work with. In the sideboard, we're actually seeing multiple copies of Disdainful Stroke, one more than we are seeing in most other sideboards, along with some negates. Not so heavy on the negates as a lot of the decks go. The big thing in the sideboard here I wanted to point out was the Thief of Sanities. Against control decks that may be taking out a lot of their removal, they may not have enough removal left in their deck to deal with the Thief of Sanity in game 2 and 3. And if they do leave in enough removal to deal with your Thief of Sanity, then you may actually already be ahead in that matchup, depending on the formation that they've used for their deck in games 2 and 3. Against green decks that have absolutely, little to none when it comes to removal, the Thief of Sanity is absolutely wonderful. Against cards like Vinemayer and things of that nature, a lot of times you can just grab a green creature off the top of their library and cast it and use it to block their Vinemayer, just giving you 2-for-1s all day. So I do like that card. Last but not least here, the first place deck from the Star City Games Standard Classic. This is your Boros Angels deck. Now, this particular version is running the Adantos Vanguard along with Knight of Grace, History of Benalia as the Knight package. Now, Adantos Vanguard works really, really well with Deafening Clarion, and being able to just only take 1 net damage and keeping a creature on the battlefield from an early Deafening Clarion, wiping the board, getting through with an Adantos Vanguard, gaining that 3 life back, cost you 1 life to wipe the board and keep a dude. So that's not very bad. Also, with cards like Resplendent Angel, if you do get out something like a Lyra, Resplendent Angel is now large enough to survive cards or to survive Deafening Clarion. Even though she will automatically have lifelink, you might still want to give lifelink to some of your creatures. Like if you still have an Adanto Vanguard on the battlefield, you can definitely trigger those angels. That's kind of the idea of this deck. You want to have those Resplendent Angels. You want to have Lyra, Shala, Voice of Plenty, Aurelia, things of that nature. Really helps this deck just spiral completely out of control. Every single threat has to be answered once you get started. Of course, Shala helping you control answers that would be going towards cards like Lyra or your Resplendent Angel. They have to be targeted versus Shala before they can actually jump in to just dealing with Aurelia and Lyra and Resplendent Angel and things of that nature. Also, it does need to be mentioned that Aurelia can give the additional +2 needed for Resplendent Angel to just swing by itself to gain the life link. You do need to gain 5 points of life in order to trigger your 4/4, and Aurelia can help you get there with the Resplendent Angel. So not to mention the fact that Resplendent Angel can just get there by itself by giving itself +2/+2 and lifelink in the late game. So pretty cool deck. I do like this deck. I think that it might have a little bit of a bad matchup against some of the control decks where you're not able to play multiple cards per turn. So if they can just 1-for-1 you, then you might not get as far. That's kind of why I like the Mentor decks a little bit better. The Mentor decks that at least have the Angel package in the side, so that you can kind of side into the Angels. Or have some of the Angel package in the main board. I think that the Boros Angels decks will continue to morph over the next couple of weeks, and then I highly expect to see this as a contender come Pro Tour. So we will see in the future if the Boros Angels decks have what it takes to stick around. They may not. We will find out. Settle the Wreckage here in the sideboard for the for the Angels deck. It is not uncommon for the deck to have a ton of really big cards in their hand and not want to actually apply more pressure to the battlefield. It's also not uncommon for these decks to just go ahead and turn sideways and then allow your opponent to swing into you, and sometimes that may be your opponent's best answer is to try to race you in damage, and that's normally when your Settle the Wreckages are going to become in handy, when you're just constantly getting your cards sideways, leaving that opening, and it's not actually just forecasting that you have a settle because of how many big creatures could be in the deck and how many cards that are legendary. So if you're looking at your opponent who has 4 open mana, it could be just because they have an additional Lyra in their hand, they don't want to cast it. They may already have a Shala in their hand, they don't want to cast it, because they have one on the battlefield. So it's not just foreshadowing that it is a Settle the Wreckage. In my experience, people are more likely to swing into your tapped Angels trying to race you. So other than that, 4 copies of Seal Away and a singleton copy of Ixalan's Binding here in the sideboard. 3 copies of Banefire works great in the control matchups and giving you a little bit of extra reach to just finish the games off. And then, of course, the last copy of Deafening Clarion. This seems to be the card to kind of wipe the board in our current meta. And then if you need to deal with opposing Planeswalkers and things of that nature, Sorcerer's Spyglass seems to be doing the trick for most of these decks. All right, guys. That is your top 8. That is the top decks from the PTQ this weekend. That is the top decks from the Team Constructed event. And then the entire top 8 from your Standard Classic. I hope you guys enjoyed the content. Don't forget to hit that like, that subscribe button. Share the video with your friends. Say, hey, what do you think of these decks? And we're going to see you back here later today. Every day this week except for Friday. Go play F&M, support your local gaming store. But we're going to be streaming every day this weekend here on YouTube Gaming. So if you guys want to see some of Dev from SBMTG's decks, he's got some nice decks coming out, and we're going to be playing those. Also, we're going to be playing this Boros Angels deck. So I'm going to be coming out with a full deck tech on the Boros Midrange and Boros Angels. We're going to be looking at all of the different versions of Boros and what is the best configuration or the most likely configuration to move forward with. So if you guys want to check that out, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. As always, if you want to play any of these decks, check out Mana Trader's rental service, where you pay a flat rate to play all the Magic in that you could possibly want. Just all the Magic, all the cards, play everything. It's great. I promise you, I wouldn't endorse it if it wasn't a good product. It's awesome. Serious. Check out Mana Traders. Links in the description. Save yourself some money while you're doing it. I'm Sideboard MTG.